afternoon, sports fans, and welcome to today's lecture on the Gladiatorial Games. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're putting on our armor, we're grabbing our sword, and we're making our way into the arena. That's right, we're going to learn about the most violent, the most deadly of all the games in classical antiquity. Now, we might look back at the Romans and condemn them for their violence and bloodlust, cheering on the gladiators in the arena, but you gotta ask yourself whether we're so different. I mean, millions of people watch 300-pound men smash into each other to move the pigskin on any given Sunday. And fight nights now primarily involved almost anything goes ultimate fighting. Moreover, we need to remind ourselves that the gladiatorial games within ancient Rome were more than about just bloodshed, right? They sent messages about empire, messages about piety, messages about reverence for the dead, and about the power of the emperor. So whether you're looking to fight to the death or you'd rather beg the emperor for mercy, journey with me as we investigate the Roman Gladiatorial Games. Alright, so when we think about the gladiatorial games, we usually picture something like Russell Crowe in the Colosseum, fighting off wave after wave of imposing gladiators. And eventually, those grand fights do indeed come into being. I mean, gladiatorial games are, after all, contests between at least two combatants, clad in armor, and bearing deadly weapons. But how did we get here, right? How did these games emerge, pitting man against man, armed with deadly weapons? How did there come to be tens of thousands of people cheering for blood in the arena? Well, the very first gladiatorial games in Rome are recorded to have occurred in 264 BCE, so right in the middle of the Roman Republic. In fact, that's the same year that Rome defeated the Etruscans at Volsini, and the same year that they first went to war with Carthage. Now, the term gladiator comes from the Latin gladius, a type of short, straight sword, often used by Roman infantry. And in ancient Rome, a spectacle with gladiatorial games was called a munus, or a MUNERA in the plural, which translates kind of roughly as a duty or a gift. And these earliest games, they represented a duty or gift to the dead. That's right, the earliest ones, they started out as funeral gladiatorial games. And in this instance, they were put on for a man named Decimus Junius Brutus in 264. Those games were organized and hosted by his sons, and in that spectacle, 3 pairs of gladiators did battle in the Forum Boarium in the center of Rome. Now, it's not like the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus just invented the gladiatorial games out of thin air, right? And if you think about when this occurred, right, in the exact same year that Rome defeats the Etruscans, and if you think about Etruscan sport and spectacle, which we've talked a little bit about here and which has numerous examples of combat sports, especially wrestling and boxing, depicted in funerary contexts, especially things like tomb paintings, right? Like we saw with the Tomb of the Augurs, dating all the way back to the 500s BC. If you combine those combat sports with things like the Fairsu game, right? With the bound captive being attacked by the dog, right? When you do all that and you think about that, you might very well imagine that the Romans adopted the idea for gladiatorial games straight from the Etruscans. And if you thought that, you'd be in good company. So for a long time, scholars assumed that there was a direct connection here. But more recently, archaeologists have pointed out disconnects with this theory. So, for example, in the Etruscan examples, we never actually see combatants equipped with any weapons or armor. And rather, modern scholars now tend to look at southern Italy as the originator of the gladiatorial games. So in this location in southern Italy, diverse tribes, so we have the Campanians and the Lucanians and the Oscans and the Samnites and the Sabellians, right? They all seem to have engaged in similarly ritualistic funerary combats, as can be seen on their tomb paintings here, as well as on sarcophagi, as well as on vases. Now the earliest of these games go back to the 4th century BCE, a century prior to the earliest recorded games in Rome. And as we can see with this fresco here from a Lucanian tomb, this dates to around 360 BCE and starts to show that kind of armed combat between two individuals. Now another Lucanian tomb from a few decades later shows more one-on-one armed combat. And a century later, another tomb from the region of Paestum shows single combatants armed and bloodied from their contest. Now Rome's battle against the Samnites at the end of the 4th century BCE would have introduced Rome both to the weapons and to the armor of the Samnites, and to their practice of armed funerary games, making it very likely that these practices from southern Italy had at least some sort of influence on the earliest games in Rome. So our best guess is that the earliest gladiatorial games, they were funeral games put on in honor of a deceased aristocrat, and that they merged elements of Etruscan funerary games and Campanian or southern Italian funerary games into a single new thing, the Roman gladiatorial games. Now, gladiators didn't just grab any old weapon and shield prior to their fights. As the games developed, Romans established particular sets of weapons and armor, creating various types of gladiators. These gladiators were in large part based on the various tribes that Rome conquered throughout the Roman Republic. So, for example, here we have the Samnus, or the Samnite gladiator, based on the Italian tribe south of Rome. Now, the Samnite gladiator here, right, he's equipped like a Samnite soldier, with a gladius or short sword, with a rectangular shield known as the scutum, a greave for leg protection, and a large helmet, with a brim and a protective visor, as well as a plume attached to the top. We also have the Thrax, or the Thracian gladiator, which was based on the region north and east of Italy, and the Gallus, or the Gallic gladiator, based on the tribes in the north of Italy and the west of modern-day France. Now, it doesn't take very much speculation to get a sense for what Rome was doing here, right? By dressing gladiators like their conquered foes, they were symbolically proclaiming their dominance over these cultural groups, forcing them to fight and at times die for the honoree of the funeral games or for the entertainment of the masses in the later Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire. Now, in the early days, similar gladiatorial types seemed to have been paired against each other to compete. So a Samnite soldier would fight another Samnite, or a Thrax would fight another Thrax. But over time, Romans shifted their preference to pitting two different types of gladiators against each other, each with strategic advantages and potentially life-threatening weaknesses. So, for example, the Romans would often pit the Thrax, right, that is the Thracian, against the Murmillo, based on a soldier type in Gaul. Now, the Thrax used a curved short sword known as the Sica, whereas the Murmillo used the traditional straight gladius. And the Thrax wore knee-high greaves on both legs and thick padding on the upper legs, whereas the Murmillo only had one greave. In return, the Thrax only had a small shield known as the Parma, whereas the Murmillo had the large rectangular scutum. And you can think about how this might play out, right? So the Thrax had more armor, but a smaller shield. And the Murmillo had less armor, but a larger shield. But despite that larger shield, the Thrax curved short sword, the Sica, it was specifically designed to be able to curve around that large shield and stab and draw blood from the Murmillo from the side. Now, another classical example is the Retiarius versus the Secutor. And the Retiarius was the most lightly armored of all the gladiators. He had only an arm guard and a shoulder guard and a belt, so no body armor really of any type, and he didn't even have a helmet. Now offensively, he was equipped like a fisherman. So he was given a net with which to snare his opponent, and he was given a trident to stab at his opponent from distance. And as a last resort, he had a dagger as well, just in case he lost his trident during the battle. Now, opposite the Retiarius, right, the lightly armed person, was the Secutor, one of the most heavily armored of all the gladiators. So he was the evolution of the Bermilo we just described above. And the Secutor had both arm and leg armor, and he carried the scutum, or the large rectangular shield. His helmet covered his head and face, and he only had 2 small eye slits, which prevented effective stabs to the face by the Retiarius' trident. It just couldn't get in there. And then his helmet was also rounded and smooth on the top, and this was done to prevent it from becoming ensnared in the Retiarius' net. So you can imagine the divergent strategies here, right? The Retiarius, with long-range weapons and little armor, would want to move quickly and attack from long range with the trident and with the net. Whereas the Secutor would want to get in close, and with his heavy armor and his heavy helmet, right, and his short sword, he would want to try to take away the mobility and the range of the Retiarius. Now eventually, these types of differences drew their own groups of fans. So we have the Scutarii becoming fans of the preferred fighters with the scutum, right, the large rectangular shield. And that contrasted with the Pamularii, right, being fans of the preferred fighters with the Parma or the small shield. And even Roman emperors fell into these categories, choosing their favorite type of gladiator. Now, as the games developed over time in ancient Rome, they transitioned from playing the role of funerary games, right, the MUNERA we just talked about, to simply being put on for the enjoyment of spectators. And we call these displays ludi, which translates as, well, games. So the ludi started as celebrations to please the gods, and they included parades and feasts and chariot races. And again, in later times, they also included gladiatorial games as well. Now, the day of the spectacle would begin with the pompa, or the ceremonial procession, where the editor, right, that's the Latin name for the person who was in charge of the games, he would parade around the competitors and the prizes for all the spectators to witness. Now, if it was part of a larger set of spectacles, perhaps including beast hunts and executions, the gladiatorial games would most often take place in the afternoon, in the later part of the day. Now, the fight would begin with the blasting sound of a horn, and sometimes this would be accompanied by music. Gladiators would go at each other, trying to leverage the strengths of their weapons and armor and take advantage of their opponent's weaknesses. The match would end when one of 2 things happened. So either one of the combatants was killed, or one of the combatants surrendered. And he did this by pointing to the editor with an outstretched finger. And you can still see that in images like this, where the gladiator is surrendering during the games. Now, in the earliest games, most scholars agree that death was the most likely outcome. But as the games grew in frequency and they grew in popularity, mercy became more common. The editor would weigh the merits of the defeated gladiator, taking into account how the spectators felt about the gladiator's performance as well. And then he would either grant him a missio, the Latin term for the sparing of his life, or grant him death. Now, everyone's familiar with the famous thumbs up or thumbs down sign, right? More popularly, the thumbs down sign that the emperor would use, or the editor would use, to signal that a defeated gladiator should be given death. In reality, however, we're not sure that this thumbs down was actually that symbol. The ancient sources do describe this, and they say that the sign for death was given by the editor, and it was known as the pollice or the pollice verso, which translates as the turned thumb, right? But it doesn't say which way the thumb turned, right? Whether it turned up or down. And in fact, most scholars today think that it was actually a thumbs up that would indicate death, because the thumb would then be pointing to the jugular or the throat, right? Where the combatant would be killed. Now, one of the big questions is how frequent this death actually was in the arena. And that's another good question here, right? In the earliest funeral games, it seems that the loser, often a criminal or a prisoner or a slave, would indeed be expected to die. But as the games progressed and increased in popularity, it became clear that it was really expensive to train and maintain gladiators, right? And you'd lose a lot of money if they were dying every other time they went into the arena. And as a result, the missio was a relatively common event by the end of the early Roman Empire, with only about 1 in 5 fights ending in death, meaning that you had about a 10% chance of dying each time you went into fight if it was an evenly balanced fight. Now, of course, this isn't spread completely equally though, right? If you were new and you were untrained, there's a pretty good chance you weren't making it out of there alive after your first fight or two, right? If you were a veteran, however, and especially if you were famous and you were popular, your chances of dying went dramatically down. I mean, who wants to kill off their most popular gladiator? That's the golden goose right there. Now, a gravestone in Italy shows one such case. So it says, Flamma, that's the name of the gladiator, right? Flamma, secutor. He lived 30 years. He fought 34 times, won 21 times, drew 9 times, and was spared 4 times. Syrian by birth, Delicatus made this tomb for a worthy comrade at arms. So we see a gladiator commemorated after death. We also see that it was possible to win, it was possible to lose and be spared, but it was also possible to draw, right, or tie the fight. Now, worthy fighters like Flamma could also earn the rudis, a wooden gladius that symbolized the freedom of the gladiator, providing the opportunity for them to leave the arena and begin life as a freed citizen. Now, Flamma earned the rudis 4 different times during his career, but each time he declined it and decided to keep fighting as a gladiator. That true fighting spirit there. Way to go, Flamma. All right, now who were the gladiators and how did they fit into Roman society? So in the earliest days, the gladiatorial combatants would have been slaves or criminals or prisoners forced to fight, possibly to the death, as a ritual sacrifice for aristocratic funerals. But over time, gladiators became more professional in a way, right? They still might have been slaves, most commonly prisoners of war from far-flung corners of Rome's growing empire. But now, they became far more professional. So they trained in gladiatorial schools, known as the ludus, right? Swearing the oath to quote-unquote be burned by fire, bound in chains, to be beaten, to die by the sword. And you can still see the gladiatorial training school in Rome, the Ludus Magnus, right? The great school, partially excavated and adjacent to the Colosseum. Now, one of the cool things here is that the center of the arena of the Ludus Magnus was built to the exact same dimensions as the Colosseum's floor, so that the gladiatorial trainees could get an exact feel for the dimensions of the space they would be fighting in. Now, officially, gladiators were socially considered infames, which literally means disreputable or dishonored. And it was an official social status that prevented people from doing different things, right? Fully participating in politics, fully participating in law, fully participating in religious rituals. So infames, for example, they couldn't testify in a Roman court, or they couldn't run for high Roman political offices. And just to give you a sense, other infames include things like people in the prostitution industry, right? Both pimps and prostitutes, as well as other entertainers, things like actors and dancers and charioteers. So this official disreputable social status, though, it didn't mean that gladiators totally lacked social power. And in fact, it's weirdly just the opposite. So gladiators could become incredibly famous, incredibly rich, and incredibly powerful. Like modern athletes or actors. They were seen as sex symbols, and ancient Roman authors comment how even noble women couldn't resist the allure of a powerful gladiator. Now, the fame and sex appeal of gladiators was apparently enough to get some free citizens to voluntarily join the arena. These were known as the octorati, who contracted for specific gladiatorial contests without having to become one of the infames. It was kind of like a temporary thing. Now, scholars debate how frequently this actually happened, but apparently it was common enough that the Senate had to pass legislation, several pieces of legislation, banning elites from doing this, right? So they didn't allow the senatorial class or the equestrian class from Rome to participate in games in this way, in the manner of the octorati. So emperors even found the games alluring enough to enter themselves into combat, right? This didn't happen all the time, but it did on occasion. Now, I don't imagine this was much of a fair fight, but we do get emperors, right? Like Caligula, like Nero, and like Commodus, who end up going into the arena. Now, Commodus himself, he fancied himself as Hercules reborn, and he actually did this pretty frequently. He'd always end up having his opponents submit to him, always granting them mercy in the end. But actually, when he was training, he often would kill his training partners. So kind of weird. He wouldn't kill the people in the arena, he would kill his training partners. Anyway, sometimes his fighting went beyond other gladiators, and historians record Commodus killing 100 lions in a single day, followed by 3 elephants on another day, and he even killed a giraffe. A poor giraffe! And the ancient Roman people thought this was really messed up because they thought the giraffe was such a cute and helpless creature, which of course they were totally right about. Anyway, Commodus charged the city of Rome 1 million sesterces every time he fought, and because he did it so frequently, he nearly bankrupted the Roman treasury just because he fought in the arena so many times and charged the Roman city so much for his participation in that. So we just saw that despite the low social standing of gladiators, Roman emperors would sometimes step into the arena to showcase their fighting prowess. But that wasn't the only connection between politics and the gladiatorial games. In fact, as the games transitioned from funerary rites to public spectacle, they became increasingly used by Roman politicians. First tribunes and aediles and praetors and consuls, right? The magistrates of the Roman Republic, and then later by Roman emperors. And this was all done to curry favor with the Roman people and to win their support. So Gaius Gracchus, the tribune of the plebs in 122 BCE, took down the barriers that surrounded the arena in the Roman Forum in order to allow people from all over to come and see the games. With the idea that hopefully after watching the games, right, that he helped them watch, they would then go vote for him in the upcoming election. A half century later, the Roman general Sulla was the first to put on a show with 100 maned lions. And he instituted annual games in honor of his military victories. Pompey the Great, Rome's general and later rival of Caesar, was famed for his beast hunts, bringing more than 500 lions to Rome, and even importantly, the very first rhinoceros, right? He was the first one to ever bring a rhinoceros into the city of Rome, just to be hunted in the Circus Maximus. Now, perhaps more than anyone who came before him, Julius Caesar, in the middle of the 1st century BCE, saw that the political power, right? He saw the political power that the gladiatorial spectacles could possess. And as an aedile, the magistrate who was in charge of public performances, Caesar put on funeral games for his dad, who died like 20 years earlier. And he kept more than 300 pairs of gladiators on hand to compete in these games, an order of magnitude more, right? 10 times more than anyone who preceded him. 2 decades later, after returning from Gaul and his battles against the Senate, Caesar celebrated 4 different triumphs in less than a month. And he would recreate entire battles with hundreds or thousands of armed troops, putting on a show of epic proportions. And amazingly, sometimes these were battles at sea. So Caesar would be the first to put on what are known as naumachia, or naval battles. And he did this by digging a massive basin in the Campus Martius, where thousands of oarsmen would row boats and battle one another. Now, these ended up actually serving not just as performances, but really spectacular executions for the prisoners and slaves who had to row those boats and compete in those battles. Now, Caesar's eventual successor, Augustus, also made use of the games to placate a population exhausted from decades of civil war. He put on at least 8 sets of gladiatorial games, where more than 1,000 men took part in the combats. And he built upon Caesar's naumachia, recreating the Battle of Salamis, that famous Greek battle where the Greeks led by the Athenians defeated the Persians. And he did that with more than 3,000 fighters. Other games, triumphs, and festivals were common under Augustus as well, and these played a significant role in his ability to maintain sole power in a volatile time as the Roman Empire emerged out of the bloody mess that was the end of the Roman Republic. Now, in some ways, what we get with the gladiatorial games in ancient Rome is completely different than anything we have in the modern world. I mean, these consisted of slaves, equipped with armor and weapons, fighting each other, trying and sometimes succeeding at killing each other. Armed combat, potentially to the death, just isn't something we do very commonly anymore, and that's probably for the best. That being said, we undoubtedly still revel in physically demanding contact sports, right? And sometimes even combat sports as well, that often leave participants with significant and lasting injuries. So college and pro football players are often seen as modern-day gladiators, right? Developing their bodies into hulking masses of speed and muscle, and then doing physical combat or physical battle with their opponents, trying to physically dominate them on the playing field. And this all happens as tens of thousands of screaming fans shout their approval or disapproval in the stands. A more in-depth look makes the comparison even more complex. So on the one hand, the goal of modern football is not to kill the opponent, right? At least literally, maybe you want to kill them metaphorically. Anyway, and while people have died, it usually is the result of an unfortunate accident rather than kind of being a major part of the nature of the game, right? It's usually from a simultaneous health condition or something along those lines. But serious injuries, they are commonplace, with broken bones and torn ligaments and concussions, something that undoubtedly happened dozens of times throughout the league during the course of a single season. Now, in ancient Rome, the gladiators themselves were slaves, often obtained through Rome's military victories abroad. And with American football, we have willing participants, right? More like the octorati. And at least at the pro level, these participants are very highly paid. And football players certainly have more agency than your average Roman gladiator. Both gladiators and football players, they can both gain social and cultural fame for their exploits in their respective sports. And in ancient Rome, you might argue that the gladiatorial games wouldn't exist without spectators, right? That is, the only reason they have these fights was to please the viewers, with little or no regard for the athletes themselves. Now, you might be able to argue that to some extent this is the case with football, right? The NFL probably wouldn't exist, it would probably disappear if there were no viewers. But there are plenty of people who play the sport at lower levels simply for the love of the sport itself, not really to entertain outside spectators. So are football players modern-day gladiators? Well, that's up for you to decide. Got to decide that one for yourself. All right, you have made it to the end of another episode. Now, in today's lecture, we have seen the rise of the ancient Roman gladiator, likely from a series of Etruscan and Campanian and native Roman influences all mixing together, right? These gladiators are most often slaves, captured in war as Rome's power spread across the Mediterranean and beyond. And Rome would equip these slave gladiators with specific sets of armor, often based on the military styles of their conquered foes. And then they would pit specific gladiator types against one another. Now, in the arena, the gladiator won by either killing his opponent or forcing him to submit, right? Placing one finger into the air. Whereupon the game's host would then determine whether to grant him mercy, a missio, or carry through with the death blow. Now, in society, gladiators were considered infames, a disreputable class, but that didn't stop them from becoming incredibly popular, especially with the ladies. And as Roman history progressed, some of Rome's most famous generals and politicians leveraged the power and popularity of the Roman gladiatorial games to gain support for their specific causes. So, if you're ready to do battle, don't forget your gladius. Win, and you might just win your freedom. Just a couple of lessons you can learn from the Roman gladiatorial games.